A Great Argead Saga Alexein, Alexander the Great. Volume 1, Telesias, The War Dance. By Macedonian. A new episode every single day. Episode 10, Prothesis. Funeral Custom, The Census of Loyalty. The smell of death fought a losing battle against the cloying sweetness of frankincense and myrrh. In the center of the great hall, where only hours ago heavy war drums had thundered, a chilling silence now reigned. King Alexander II lay upon a ceremonial bronze cline, his transition from a living sovereign to a silent icon complete. The royal women had performed the primary washing. His skin, once bronzed by the sun of the drilling grounds, was now ashen, rubbed with oils that shimmered under the flickering torchlight. A purple chlamys, the color of the Argead house, was draped over his chest, artfully concealing the jagged puncture wound that had claimed his life. Ptolemy of Aloros stood at the head of the couch, his blood-splattered festival tunic replaced by a robe of deep mourning gray. I must act with absolute coldness, he resolved, hardening his posture. I cannot allow them to see fear or paranoia. Let them believe what they want. It is a waste of spirit to exhaust my mind tracking their whispers. His performance was flawless. He stood with head bowed, a hand resting protectively on the edge of the cline. In Macedonian tradition, the man who manages the funeral manages the succession, and to the trembling court, this was the ultimate theater of legitimacy. He was the light of our house, Ptolemy's voice boomed softly, a practiced guttural tremor in his throat. A monstrous shadow stole him from us tonight. But I swear upon the bones of our ancestors, the Argead flame will not flicker while I breathe. I will shelter young Perdiccas as if he were my own blood. In a twisted sense, it was true. Having worked alongside King Amyntas III for decades, Ptolemy had watched these princes grow. Lacking sons of his own, Perdiccas, Philip, and the spare bloodlines were his substitute children, and they desperately needed protection until they were mature enough to survive on their own. They no longer had a father to provide discipline. Who else will teach them to be sharp and intelligent? He thought. I must be harsh with them, even if they hate me for it. It is for their own good. Philip stood in the shadows of the western pillars, his mother's hand a vice-like grip on his shoulder. He watched Ptolemy's hand, the same hand that had signaled the flute players hours prior, now gently smoothing the shroud over Alexander's cold feet. The hypocrisy felt like the smoke from the braziers, stinging his eyes and clogging his throat. Ptolemy hesitated as he reached out, a fleeting tremor passing through his fingers before they brushed the linen. He was looking at the corpse, but his mind was looking at a mirror. By all rights, he was the one who should have been lying there cold, a target of the young king's planned purge. Imagining himself on that bronze couch shook him to his core. The phantom image of his own violent demise refused to fade, the unspoken guilt of a man whose life had been saved by a miracle of timing, leaving a reckless boy to pay the ultimate price instead. Look at his hands, Philip, Queen Eurydice whispered, her voice a sharp, icy needle in his ear. Ptolemy does not touch the body with his palm. He touches it with his fingertips. Even now, the coward fears the blood of a king will stain him forever. Preoccupied by their fury, Eurydice and her inner circle desperately needed a singular, visible enemy to anchor their rage. Ptolemy was the perfect canvas. Beside Eurydice stood young Perdiccas, the new, hollow-eyed puppet king. He stood like a ghost, his eyes fixed on Alexander's face, paralyzed by a grief he was too young to weaponize. The heavy oak doors groaned open and a tense murmur rippled through the gathered assembly. Queen Gygia entered the hall, draped in the heavy, unyielding blacks of a secondary widow, flanked by her three shadow princes Archelaus, Argead, and Menelaus. Directly behind them marched a small, formidable vanguard of northern border generals and regional power brokers. Among them stood General Leonidas, commander of the elite Elymniad heavy cavalry, and Lord Aeripus of Lyncestis, representing the fiercely independent upper country barons. Beside them were General Parmenion, his face an unreadable mask of exhaustion, and Antipater, whose cold eyes scanned the room to count the operational guard strength. The iron armor of the commanders clattered softly in the sacred silence. Gygia glided toward the cline, her face an unreadable mask of aristocratic solemnity. She bowed deeply to the grieving Eurydice, a gesture that felt less like comfort and more like a tactical parry. "The house of Amyntas weeps tonight, sister," Gygia said, her low, gravelly voice carrying across the limestone flags. She turned her sharp eyes down to young Perdiccas, and then, slowly, she shifted her gaze to Philip. Her 3 sons stepped forward in perfect, chilling unison, bowing their heads deeply to the 14-year-old half-brother they had planned to abandon to the south. "We vow our steel and our blood to the survival of our father's lineage," Archelaus murmured, his voice flat, his cold eyes locking with Philip's for a fraction of a second. It was a terrifyingly public performance of unity, designed to shield them from the regent's immediate wrath, while keeping their hands clean in the eyes of the assembly. The northern generals stepped up next, their boots heavy with the dust of the frontier. Leonidas and Aripus offered their solemn, clipped condolences to Eurydice, but their eyes kept shifting nervously toward Ptolemy and the wall of personal estate guards lining the exits. The Prothesis had become a live census of loyalty. Every nod, every bowed head was a vote cast under the shadow of a blade. Throughout it all, Euryno sat near the base of the cline, her bridal silks torn, her face deathly pale. She had kept her absolute silence as the court paraded past her brother's corpse. But as her mother-in-law, Gygia, stepped back, Euryno's eyes cut through the haze of incense and locked onto her new husband, Ptolemy. She didn't weep. She merely stared into his eyes, her gaze raw, piercing, and laced with a silent, desperate command. "We need to talk." Now, Ptolemy caught the look. A small, almost imperceptible tightening occurred at the corner of his jaw. He gave a final, solemn nod to the assembly, stepped away from the bronze couch, and walked out through the side archway into the darkened, private corridor of the inner court. Euryno rose immediately, her heavy skirts hissing against the stone as she followed him. The moment the heavy tapestry fell behind them, cutting off the view of the great hall, she stepped into his path. "Did you do it?" she asked. The whisper was a jagged blade. "Look at me, Ptolemy. Did you kill my brother?" Ptolemy stopped dead. He turned to her, his face twisting into an expression of wounded, defensive outrage. He took her by the shoulders, his grip tight, his eyes wide with a frantic sincerity. "Why should I?" he hissed back, his voice a harsh, desperate whisper. "You are speaking nonsense, Euryno. What benefit do I have in inheriting this broken kingdom? Look at the ledger. We have no money. The treasury is empty. The Illyrians are gathering at the western gates, and the northern clans are ready to revolt. I'm not a conqueror tonight. I am the fool carrying a miserable, bleeding burden instead of Perdiccas. If I didn't step into the gap, the kingdom would tear itself apart before sunrise." He leaned closer, his breath hot against her cheek. "I know everybody thinks I am the one who killed your brother, because he planned to execute me first, right? Yes, I'm incredibly glad my life was spared for some miraculous reason, but think of the reality. Whether I killed Alexander or not, I'm here to rebuild this massive ruin to save you and your family. I'm here to save all of Macedonia from being cornered by the fangs of our enemies. I'm not the enemy here, the enemies are out there. Bartolus of Illyria, Alexander of Phaerae, Pausanias the Pretender, and even the plotting factions of the Lyncestians and Elymiots. We are on the brink of total annihilation, Euryno. Wake up." Euryno stared up at him, her chest heaving. The sheer weight of his logic hit her like a physical blow. He sounded so rational, so burdened by the crown rather than enticed by it. For a terrifying, fleeting second, she almost bought his answer. But as Ptolemy turned to bark an order to a nearby guard, the cold Macedonian air cleared her mind, and a dizzying wave of psychological horror washed over her. If the regent didn't do it, then who? Her mind spun into a frantic, paranoid maze. If it wasn't her husband, then the monster was still sitting in that room. Could it be Gygia? Had the secondary queen struck down Alexander to clear a path for Archelaus? Or was it an outsider? A rogue faction of the Lyncestian lords trying to decapitate the house of Amyntas entirely. The realization that she was surrounded by invisible assassins made the dark corridor feel claustrophobic, suffocating. Back in the great hall, the voice of a herald shattered the heavy silence, echoing off the cold limestone like a strike against iron. "We leave for Igi at dawn. The king goes to his fathers." As the court began to file out to prepare for the funeral march, Philip took one last look at his brother's corpse, and then at the maneuvering royals shifting around it. He didn't see a court honoring a dead king. He saw a pack of wolves calculating the meat on a sacrifice. His brothers, both full and half, moved in lockstep beside him, their young faces hardened into rigid, silent masks of protocol. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared to breathe a word that wasn't rehearsed. Philip reached into his gray tunic, his fingertips brushing the hard wooden batoon of his secret cipher. The wood was cold, but it anchored him. The dead belonged to the past, he told himself, forcing his racing pulse to steady. Stay sharp. Stay silent. Stay alive. The Regent walked away first, surrounded by his personal vanguard, their heavy boots a rhythmic thud against the floor. Behind him, the crowd parted as the two queens stepped into the courtyard. The boys trailed a few paces back, a line of silent shadow princes. As the attendants drifted toward the chariots, Gygia suddenly broke formation. Her hand, cold and deliberate, shot out from her dark robes and clamped onto Eurydice's wrist. It was an audacious, shocking break in protocol, but before Eurydice could pull away, Gygia dragged the first queen into the deep shadow of a limestone alcove, far from the prying ears of the lords. I did not strike down your son, Gygia hissed, her face inches from her rivals. Her eyes were wide, frantic with a clinical terror. I swear it by the hearth of Amyntas. It was not my hand, nor my son's. Eurydice stared back at her, her jaw tight, evaluating the secondary queen with a terrifyingly detached clarity. After a long, agonizing heartbeat, Eurydice let out a sharp, bitter breath. She believed her. Not out of affection, but out of basic calculation. If Gygia had orchestrated this bloodbath, she would have to be monumentally, ruinously stupid to do it now, leaving her own sons exposed in a palace surrounded by Ptolemy's spears. Gygia was a viper, but she wasn't a fool. Before Eurydice could speak, Euryno slipped into the alcove, her face pale, her breathing shallow as she reeled from her private confrontation with her husband. Eurydice turned bluntly to her daughter, her voice a sharp whip. What did he say? Ptolemy denied it, Euryno whispered, her voice trembling so violently. She had to press her back against the cold stone wall. He was furious that I even asked. He told me I was thinking nonsense. He asked what benefit he could possibly gain from inheriting a broken kingdom. Mother, he looked me in the eyes, and said he was the fool, carrying a miserable, bleeding burden instead of Perdiccas. Gygia let out a low, gravelly hum, her fingers tracing the edge of her robe. The bastard makes a good point. If the Regent did it, none of this madness makes sense unless we look past the coin. His own house is rich indeed. He does not need wealth but power and authority. Still, to seize them now is a nightmare. It only aligns if he acted out of absolute survival to save his own head from Alexander's sword. He saved his life, but as a bargain, he has inherited a massive ruin on his shoulders. But if he is not the one, which nation struck the match? Ptolemy said the exact same thing, Euryno added desperately, searching her mother's eyes for answers. He said he inherited a ruin. Then he may be hiding his true motive, or the true truth. He is hiding something, my gut tells me. Eurydice growled, her grief mutating into a hot, focused rage. I know that man's ambition. He climbed the ladder to become my husband's most trusted advisor. If the Regent did this, if he killed my son to save his own life, he now needs to save the kingdom to play the savior. But, since the treasury is empty and the crown is a burden, he must have a greater reason, a reason hidden across the borders. There is an outside faction involved in this, Gygia. A foreign hand may be holding his leash. The weight of the realization settled over the three women like oil. They weren't just dealing with a domestic coup. They were looking at the potential dismantling of Macedonia itself. Gygia turned her sharp, predatory gaze directly onto the shattered princess. Let us look at it through that lens. Euryno, listen to me closely. From this moment on, you must play the fool. You must make him believe that his logic broke you, that you accept his innocence entirely. Watch his every step, count his letters, listen to the whispers of his guards. I can't, Euryno choked out, a wave of revulsion passing over her features. I won't go back into his bed. I cannot bear the thought of letting a man who likely holds my brother's blood on his hands touch me. You won't have to, Eurydice interrupted, her voice softening just enough to command her daughter's panic. She placed a firm, unyielding hand on Euryno's shoulder. Tell him you are mourning Alexander. Tell him the grief has frozen your blood, and that you are not fit for a marriage bed until the funeral fires are ash and the kingdom is secure. Use your grief as a shield, my girl. Play dumb, play the weeping widow, and find out who is paying for my son's blood. The morning sun cut through the heavy mist of the marshlands, but it brought no warmth to the royal road leaving Pella. At the front of the column, the bronze wheels of the grand funeral hearse groaned under the weight of Alexander II's oak coffin. Behind it, the road dissolved into a sprawling multi-mile dragon of iron, dust, and suppressed terror. Custom dictated a sacred peace for this first day of the march to Igi, but on the dust-choked highway, that peace felt as thin as a brittle blade. While the low-born mourning women wailed on foot, tearing at their hair in the dirt, the royal house rode. In the lead chariot, standing rigid beside the 14-year-old child King Prothesis, was Ptolemy of Aloros. The regent's hands held the reins with a white-knuckled grip, his gray mourning cloak billowing over his polished greaves. He kept his eyes locked on the road ahead, but his mind was scanning the flanking ridges. Every shadow in the tree line looked like an Illyrian spear point. Every messenger arriving from the coast brought phantom news of Pausanias the pretender. Secretly, Ptolemy's mind was miles ahead of the beer, tracking his couriers. If the messengers do not reach the southern ports, the state defaults, he calculated. His private timber deal with Athens had to be finalized by the next new moon, and his silver bribes to the eastern Thracians had to arrive in time to freeze Pausanias' advance. Every step toward the pyre was a second ticked away on a countdown to survival. Directly behind the royal carriage rode Queen Mother Eurydice. Unlike the secondary lineage, the first queen was shrouded away from the common gaze, isolated within a closed, heavy oak chariot. Dark linen curtains completely sealed the enclosure, transforming the vehicle into a private weeping fortress. Eurydice transformed her raw grief into a rigid political armor within those shadows, her face hidden from the court, but her mind fully operational. She used the slow-moving, crowded spaces of the procession to execute a series of silent internal maneuvers, slipping messages through the slits of her curtains to trusted couriers riding adjacent to her path. She focused her efforts entirely on Antipater and Old Italus. Her objective was clear and desperate: consolidate an ironclad loyalist defensive block around her remaining sons before the regent's one-day window expired and his delayed purges could begin. 100 paces back, separated by a dense wall of Ptolemy's personal estate guards, rode the secondary queen. Gygia sat on a high, unshielded cedar bench, mounted upon a heavy baggage wagon. She did not hide behind the dark linen curtains of a closet chariot, like her bitter rival, Eurydice. Gygia sat in the open air, her spine straight, her black robes pinned with heavy bronze fibulae that clattered with every rut in the road. She wanted the army to see her. She wanted the border barons to know she had not fled. Flanking her wagon were 3 open, 2-horse war chariots. Archelaus drove the first, his knuckles raw as he held the leather leads. Argead and Menelaus followed in the tracks of his wheels. To the common levies lining the ditches, the 3 shadow princes looked like a picture of dynastic solidarity, a proud vanguard guarding their father's secondary lineage. But inside the chariots, the boys were suffocating in their own adrenaline. "Keep your horses tight to the left," Archelaus hissed over the rattle of the axle, his voice barely carrying over the rhythm of the funeral drums. He didn't look back at his brothers, his eyes fixed on the bronze-tipped spears of Ptolemy's rearguard just 30 paces ahead. If the regent's men halt without an order, do not break. Ram through the line and head for the western ditch. General Leonidas's cavalry is holding the flank. If we reach his horses, Ptolemy cannot touch us without starting a civil war before noon. Argead nodded, his face slick with sweat despite the morning chill. His hands trembled on the ashwood rim of his chariot basket. Every time a shield clattered against a spear, but among the marching footmen, his chest tightened, the memory of his eldest brother's blood on the great hall floor still burning behind his eyes. He wasn't looking at the funeral bier. He was looking at the small leather pouch tied to his own belt, containing his secret cipher bond. If they were separated, if the column fractured under a sudden raid, that piece of wood was his only map to survival. The youngest, Menelaus, kept his eyes trained on the periphery. The proud mountain cavalry barons of the Lyncestians and Elymiates rode in tight, armed circles on the very edges of the road, keeping their stallions at a suspicious distance from the lowland infantry. Menelaus watched Lord Aropus of Lyncestis ride up near his mother's wagon. No words were exchanged. The sacred peace forbade political bartering during the march, but Aripus raised his chin in a cold, deliberate salute to Gygia. The message was clear: we see your boys. We are measuring their worth. Further back in the column, General Parmenion rode a gaunt warhorse, his eyes bloodshot from a night spent sending frantic commands to his western vanguard cells. By day, he was forced to endure this agonizingly slow crawl, his presence required to maintain the illusion of a united military command. But beneath his somber cloak, his fingers mapped the variables of the unfolding disaster. The scouts had reported that Bartolus' Illyrian squares were already locking onto the high foothills, waiting for the funeral smoke at Igi to clear before descending into the lowlands. Beside him, Antipater marched on foot among the senior magistrates, his analytical mind tracking a different kind of warfare. With every mile they covered, his eyes counted the grain silos and calculated the harvest yields of the passing fields. He was building an invisible administrative ledger in his head, ensuring the Axios river barges remained secure to prevent a wartime famine the moment the state erupted into open conflict. By midday, the dust had turned the purple Argead shrouds a uniform, ghostly gray. The hierarchy of the march remained unbroken, but the cracks were widening. Young Attalus and his elite lowland retainers intentionally pushed their horses close to Ptolemy's vanguard, snubbing the regent's heralds with arrogant silence. They whispered to the younger aristocratic riders, pointing toward the mountains where the foreign threats gathered, building a faction on the move. Waiting at the end of the road, anchored inside the sacred perimeter of Igi, was old General Attalus. He held the ancestral wall, commanding the battle-hardened veteran units guarding the royal tombs. As the panicked, young levies watched the court approach, the old commander used his massive legendary prestige to keep the line steady. "The Argead line does not break," he growled to the trembling conscripts, his voice a steadying anchor. When the procession finally entered the gates, Attalus treated Ptolemy with a cold, minimalist military formality. He ensured his old guard reserves remained heavily armed and strategically deployed around the perimeter, a silent, bristling counterweight to the regent's estate guards. The first day was nearly spent. Gygia closed her eyes against the burning dust, the frantic rabbit pulse of her youngest son, still echoing in her memory from the night before. She looked ahead at the closed, silent silhouette of Eurydice's curtained carriage, and then at Ptolemy's rigid back. Let them play the protectors and the mourners, she thought, her fingers tightening on the edge of her wooden bench. By sunrise, the ash will fall, and the wolves will no longer have to pretend. Beyond the valley of mourning, the rest of the world refused to weep. Completely ignoring the internal tragedy of the northern kingdom, Pelopidas of Thebes used this exact day to execute a masterclass in aggressive logistics. He pushed his elite veteran heavy infantry and Thessalian cavalry up the main southern highway in a relentless, forced march. He covered maximum ground while the Macedonians were bound by custom, timing his vanguard's arrival to strike the border the exact moment the funeral fire turned to ash. To the west, King Bartolus of Illyria exploited the court's temporary paralysis to solidify his conquest. He systematically locked his massive, heavy shield infantry squares onto the high foothills overlooking Upper Macedonia. To stoke the fires of the growing domestic panic, he allowed his raiders to torch minor border outposts within plain sight of the valley below, maximizing the psychological terror while Pella was too legally bound to launch a counteroffensive. In the south, Alexandria Ferry capitalized on the vacuum. With the Macedonian garrisons frozen in mourning and unable to support their traditional allies, the tyrant went on a savage domestic offensive. He spent this single day hunting down, disarming, and slaughtering the pro-Macedonian noble factions, most notably the Aleuadae of Larissa, completely clearing his own domestic board before the primary Argead line could recover. To the east, Pausanias the Pretender swept through the coastal plains. Knowing that Ptolemy's gold bribes were still traveling through the rugged mountain passes, Pausanias's gold-incentivized mercenaries relentlessly absorbed key settlements in Mygdonia, positioning his vanguard just a few days' march from Pella's unprotected gates. To be continued in Episode 11, Epirus, Manifest Goddess. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesias Playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle Playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 5 to 15-minute, hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below. The first day piece has officially burned to ash at Igi, and every single faction has made its move. While Gigia exposes her sons in open chariots to court the upper country barons, Eurydice remains locked within her closed, curtained chariot to plot her retaliation. Which queen's strategy will survive the morning when the multi-front firestorm breaks out across the border? Drop your tactical theories below.